It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Ed Reed to give the program tonight. Continuing with the theme of the Cherokees who live in the area, the program is about New Echota, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and the rebirth of the Cherokee Nation. Although Ed is not a native Towns County, he might as well be, because on his father's side, he comes from all those Ivy Mount Browns. No, that's on the mother's side. Father's side, whatever. He comes from the Ivy Mount Browns. On the other side, he comes from Brasstown Valley Young Harris Irwins. So he might as well be Towns County. He has a long history of interest in the Cherokee Nation, having worked 34 years with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, Parks and Historic Sites Division, several of those places, including New Echota, and worked as an interpretive historian of the Atlanta office, then administrative operations specialist, retiring in 2005 as regional manager of the Southeast Georgia Parks and Historic Sites. And with him tonight is his wife, Patty, that we welcome here. So without further ado, Ed.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I've got a long history of Towns County for sure. When I was a kid, when we went visiting friends and relatives, we always came in this direction. We never went the other way because we didn't know anybody over there. All my parents were born in and raised in Brasstown Valley, so we always came to visit all the plots, and the Reeds, my uncles and aunts lived in Young Harris, so we came in that direction. I got a message from Jerry several months ago wanting me to do this. And I haven't done this, and I haven't talked about Cherokees in, well, next month it'll be about 31 years. And I read the message and I said, no, I'm gonna sleep on it. And I slept on it, and the only thing I could figure is Jerry worked some kind of spell on me. Because the next day I said, yeah, I'll do it. So here I am. Maybe I can stand right here. I was going to stand over there, but I think maybe we can work this out. So tonight we're going to talk about the Cherokees and their rebirth. Today we'd probably call it rebranding, if you want to use a buzzword from the business world, rather than rebirth. So we're going to start out, if I can make this thing work. Nope. That one. Ah, yeah. You here behold an Indian. My kindred are Indians, and my father is sleeping in the wilderness grave. They too were Indians. But I am not as my fathers were. Broader means and nobler influences have fallen upon me. Yet I was not born as thousands are in a stately dome and amid the congratulations of the great. For on a lonely hill, in a lonely cabin, overspread by the forest oak, I first drew my breath. And in a language unknown to learned and polished nations, I learnt to lisp my fond mother's name. In after days, I've had greater advantages than most of my race, and I now stand before you delegated by my native country to seek her interest, to labor for her respectability, and by my public efforts to assist in raising her to an equal standing with other nations of the earth. Note two words in this: my country and my nation. That's going to become important later on as we move farther. This was an address given in the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia on May 26, 1826, by this man, Elias Boudinot, or Boudinot. He spelled it with two T's, and that probably meant Boudinot, but I'm going to say Boudinot because I've been saying it for 30 years. Or Galagina Uwadi. Galagina, that's my version of Cherokee, means stag deer or male deer. His last name was Wadi or Uwadi, and missionaries probably tagged him as Buck because he became known as Buck Wadi. He attended mission schools in the Cherokee Nation. He went up to Cornwall, Connecticut, and studied in the mission school there. And on his way up there, Buck Waddy met a man named Elias Boudinot. He had been president of Congress during the Confederation period and was at that time president of the American Bible Society. And the young Indian was very impressed with him, so he decided to take his name. And he became Elias Boudinot, or Boudinot. He met a young woman in that town by the name of Harriet Ruggles Gold, and he proposed to her. And they decided to get married, but there was one problem. Her parents said, absolutely not, no, not ever, never. And she fell into a bit of a, I don't know, I got the feeling that maybe she was kind of weak, and she fell into an illness and went downhill, and her parents then decided, well, okay, we'll let you marry him. It raised quite a stir in the town because Elias, his cousin, John Ridge, had married a young woman not too long before. Her name was Sarah Bird Northrup. And when these two decided to get married, it became a mess, really. Her brother objected, the townspeople objected, especially the young men. They said, these savages are coming in here and stealing our women. Ultimately, that school was closed down because of that. But how did this young man, this very articulate young man, become this way? He wasn't, as he said, exactly like there were others who weren't as well off and well educated as him, but there was a great degree of education by this time in 1826. Well, let's look back. In 1700, Cherokee Nation, or the Cherokee territory that they claimed, was, if I can find my little button here, it was quite extensive. It covered a large portion of Kentucky, what now Kentucky, a little bit of West Virginia and Virginia, western North Carolina, northern Georgia, most of Tennessee, northern Alabama. Here we go. There's South Carolina down there. Okay, I got it right, finally. But as you can see, with each one of these numbers was a land cession. The Cherokee territory was going to be, over the next 100 years especially, it's going to be shrinking in size drastically and rapidly through land cessions. And oftentimes it was because there was a lack of unity among the Cherokee. It was a town chief, it was a group of people, various and sundry ones who would cede pieces of land. At that time, Cherokees lived, and we heard about this last month, they lived in towns and villages, in houses made of wattle and daub, a woven fabric of branches covered with plastered with mud, hence the daub, and a thatched roof. The Cherokees were Iroquoian in ancestry, and they weren't like the neighboring tribes in the southeast. They were taller, they were less pronounced as far as the facial features, as far as the Roman nose and the high cheekbones, so they had different customs as well. In the midst of every town, the centerpiece of every town, was a seven-sided council house. This was where the business of the town was conducted. There were seven clans within the Cherokee Nation, hence the 7 sides. Everybody had a chance to talk and work out the problems within the town. The 7 clans were the wolf, bird, paint, long, hare, blue, wild potato, and deer. The society was matrilineal. The family was traced through the mother's side of the family. Children belonged to the mother's clan. When a couple was married, the husband came to live with the wife, and if she kicked him out, he was gone. He didn't get anything, maybe his personal belongings, but women were pretty powerful. They were able to speak in council. And occasionally they reached the title of most beloved woman. Nancy Ward was one of those. So it was a bit different society, of course, from ours. And later on it would change a little bit as well. They were hunters, gatherers, and farmers. The able-bodied males did the hunting, the gathering and farming was done by the women and the older men. They had communal plots. They had no written laws or prescribed punishments. If you did something, if you stole something, for example, they would give you, they would mock you and make fun of you and say, well, they'd give you a nickname like Sticky Fingers, something like that. If you did something a little worse than that, they would let nature take care of you. They would say, well, he'll catch a disease. He'll fall and have an accident. Something bad's going to happen to him. We're going to let nature take care of him. There was one established tradition called the blood law. If you accidentally caused someone's death, you had to give up your life. If you intentionally killed someone, you had to give up your life. The victim's clan would come for you and they would take care of you. If you were too important to your clan, they might designate somebody else to take your place, which, that would help your self-esteem, wouldn't it? I mean, if they might say, well, I'm sorry, we can't do away with this guy because he's our best ball player. He's fast, Running Wolf is fast. I'm being facetious, but anyway, he's fast. We can't afford to lose him, so we're going to pick you over here. You're just a flint napper. We got plenty of flint nappers. But at any rate, they could escape to a town of refuge, but still somebody had to take their place. And we're going to see how that changes with this rebirth. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Cherokees were about to enter a period of tremendous pressures and challenges that would bring great changes to their cultural traditions. They were surrounded by European invaders, the English on the north, the French on the west, and the Spanish to the south, and they had contact with all of them. They sometimes played them against each other. There were many land cessions, as I said, during this period as the Cherokee territory began to shrink rapidly. There was much bloodshed as well, particularly in the later part of the 18th century. Fighting along the frontiers and this cultural clash. You take the blood law, if a white man accidentally caused a Cherokee to die and they responded in the way that they were used to responding, then you had a lot of problem. And there was a lot of attacks and retaliation back and forth all along the frontier. And then during the Revolutionary War, the Cherokees sided with the British. That didn't help matters either, as far as the settlers, the revolutionaries along the borders, certainly. There were men like John Sevier. Everybody knows about Sevierville. John Sevier lived up in East Tennessee. He tried to create his own little nation or country up there, the state of Franklin. But he didn't particularly like the Cherokees, and he had told his men that when they attacked the town, that when they left, no one should be left alive. The Cherokees weren't particularly innocent either, because you had the Chickamaugas, who were relatively hostile up into the late part of the century. Dragging Canoe and Doublehead were their leaders. After Dragging Canoe died, Doublehead took over. And so there was a lot of fighting. A lot of villages were destroyed. They would see their population reduced from maybe 20,000 in 1700 to about half that by the end of the century. The fur trade was a major influence on the changing of the culture among the Cherokees. They found that they could trade hides for all sorts of those good things that they saw the settlers using. Rifles, particularly rifles, because this was going to help their hunting. It was also going to help them in wartime. Traps, cooking utensils, clothing, axes, all these things that would make their lives easier, they wanted, and they wanted a lot of them. at Old Tugelo Town, over to the southeast of here. At one point, the British employed 2 gunsmiths full time to keep Cherokee weapons up. And the reason they had to do that is because between 1700, for example, between 1700 and 1715, almost 1 million deers were taken. There was about 800 and something thousand deer hides were traded to the British. Beaver pelts, I don't know if you can see this, beaver pelts are about 9,000, fox pelts 8,000, raccoon skins 3,000, otter skins 2,000, moose hides 1,365. I mean, kind of helps us to see why we don't have any moose around anymore. Wildcats 800, black fox belts 283, elks skins 41. That's 909,000 skins that were harvested and traded to the British in a 15-year period. They were very eager to do business. They also forgot about being conservationists, I think. I think we always talk about the Native Americans being conservationists, and they were because they had to be. But when they had an opportunity to acquire a lot of good stuff, they pretty much laid waste to the animals. Peace finally came to the Cherokee with the signing of the Treaty of Holston in 1791. And one portion of that, one article in that treaty said that the Cherokee Nation may be led to a greater degree of civilization and to become herdsmen and cultivators instead of remaining in a state of hunters. The United States will from time to time furnish gratuitously the said nation with useful implements of husbandry. So the federal government would provide plows, they would provide technical assistance, they would help them to become farmers, move out of the towns as they already were to a certain extent, and take up the farming industry. George Washington was pretty benevolent in a sense toward the Cherokees, and he appointed an Indian agent, returned Jonathan Meigs, to oversee this treaty, the terms of this treaty, and Meigs himself was benevolent. He took his job seriously, and he helped the Cherokees. He provided them with implements as he was supposed to, and tried to help them protect the borders as well. But there was a thorn in their side. Who was this guy? Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had grown up in the Waxhaws on the border, the edge of the Cherokee Nation, about Waxhaws between North and South Carolina border. He'd heard stories as a child about the Cherokee and the atrocities and so forth, and he never really changed. He always referred to them as savages. He never recognized them as a sovereign nation. He didn't care who he did business with, eventually, as we'll see. This rebirth and rebranding of the Cherokees was beginning as they arose from the ashes of war and conflict of the 18th century. In the final decade of the 18th century, the Cherokees created a permanent national council to guide the future of the nation and provide against the onslaught of pressures from the United States government. As I said earlier, they had never been very united. They were beginning to realize that they had to come together as a group to oppose these land cessions and this pressure that they were getting from the settlers and from the federal government. Well, there we go. This legislature that they had created in the late 1700s, this national council began to pass laws. Every good bureaucratic government has to have laws. And they were no different, but the first thing they had to do was get rid of that blood law. They couldn't have people taking the law into their own hands. So one of the first laws that they passed was one that said, no longer will people be indebted to each other for another's life. And the clans have all agreed to this. And no longer, if someone accidentally causes an accidental death, will they be required to give up their life. They would be, from here on out, if someone did it in anger, then they would be charged with murder. Another great change that came upon the Cherokees were the missionaries. Now, there had been missionaries in the Cherokee Nation for a long time, but by the time of the 19th century rolled around, they were coming in as teachers, not just preachers, but teachers. They were providing mission schools and education for the Cherokee. And the Cherokee, particularly the leaders at this time, were more enlightened. A lot of them were mixed bloods. They had been brought up to be educated in the value of education, and they wanted to guide their people in that direction. There were the Congregationalists. These were the descendants of the Puritans. Samuel Worcester and Eleazar Butler were a couple of those, and they had missions at Brainerd and New Echota eventually. Brainerd was one of the early missionaries to the Cherokee, and they named the mission station. They had a school there, and these two guys are going to be very important here in a little bit. Baptists, Evan Jones, Duncan O'Brien, Humphrey Posey in the valley towns north of here was where they were located. My great, what was it, Jason? Two great-grandfather was named Humphrey Posey Garrett. I thought that was interesting until I found out exactly who Humphrey Posey was. He was a Baptist missionary to the Cherokees. The Methodists were not into education as much as the Baptists and the Congregationalists and the others. They were more into evangelism. They had the circuit riders, and they had their outdoor meetings and under the brush arbors and so forth, bringing the Cherokees to the Christian religion. Presbyterian, most of the major denominations were involved. The Presbyterian, Gideon Blackburn was a well-known missionary in the Cherokee Nation, and he mostly worked around in the vicinity of what is now Chattanooga. And finally, the Moravians. The Moravians came from North Carolina, and they established two missions in the Cherokee Nation, one at Spring Place and one at Uthcaloga, a little bit to the south, or to the east of what is now Calhoun, Georgia. The Uthcaloga mission stations, it survived until the 1980s, and I was terribly upset the day I found out that it burned down. It was basically it become a kind of a low rental property, and the owner, I guess, didn't really care about it. There was a historic marker out front, but unfortunately it burned, and it was the only surviving mission building left. James Vann was responsible for helping the Moravians come in. He gave them property to build a mission at Spring Place, just a few hundred feet south of this building. This is his home that he built in about 1804 at Spring Place. This is just a little bit east of Chatsworth. It's a federal style home. James Vann was a big businessman. He had a number of interests, taverns, and of course he had a plantation. He had black slaves. He was also, as we would say around here, bad to drink. And he was a mean drunk when he did drink. The Moravians kept pretty good diaries, and there were more than one occasion when they would talk about Mr. Vann being on one of his rampages. And they would occasionally, actually, I think they were a little scared of him. He never bothered them, but they were always afraid that when he had one of these spells, that he might come after them. I'm going to take a minute and tell you, I'm going to tell you a little story. A friend of mine sitting back there in the back row, I didn't know he was going to be here tonight. I told him I was going to tell this story, and he said, "Oh, okay, go ahead." And I hope I tell it right. He was a Turkey Ranger. His name was David Kirkendall. And he was my interpretive ranger at Neochoga back in the day, and we were sitting there one day. He was manning the front desk, and I was waiting to give a tour, and this woman came walking up, and she's, if you weren't here, I could do this. And she came up and she says, "I have a question. I live near where James Vann was killed. He was finally murdered. He was not a particularly well-liked man, and somebody finally took him out one day at a tavern over around Cherokee County. And so she said, I live near where James Vann was murdered, and every now and then I'm starting to see this guy, and he comes out, he's an Indian, he comes out and he sits on the stump. And I think he might be James Vann." At that point, I decided it was time for me to leave. So I took a walk down the hall so I didn't embarrass myself and the Department of Natural Resources. And I waited to hear what David said. And I can tell you right now that David, I'm sure, had on his best neutral face, and he looked her in the eye and he said, "Well, ma'am, he spoke English before he died, so the next time you see him, why don't you just ask him?" That's absolutely the best answer I think I ever heard anybody give to a question like that. The only thing is, we never did hear whether she actually talked to him and found out if it was him or not. Another great change in this rebirth was this guy. Who is this? Sequoyah. That's right, George Guest, or George Gist, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. He had seen the white men communicating on paper. And he saw this, of course, as a very powerful thing because they could send messages back and forth. And they didn't get corrupted by word of mouth. So he came up with a syllabary, not an alphabet, 46-character syllabary. Each symbol represents a sound. T, what looks like a T at least, would be I. Cherokee would be, get over here, Ta, La, Yi. Looks like G-W-Y. Cha-la-gi, or Tsa-la-gi, depending upon, there were 3 dialects in the Cherokee language, and they pronounce these a little differently. Si, I'm sorry, where am I? Yo, where is it? Na, what's yo na? Bear, that's right. And hello would be O, O, si, yo, hello. And that's the extent of my knowledge of the Cherokee language. But this spread very rapidly. Within a short period of time, a large number, maybe even 90–95% of the Cherokee had learned this. They jumped right on it. He went west. There were Cherokees who were already going west by this time. And so Sequoyah went west to teach it to them. It was a phenomenal affair. In 1820, by 1820, this was the Cherokee Nation. Remember how big it was before? Now, this is western North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. It has shrunk drastically. The Cherokees are at this point doing whatever they can to try to retain this land. They created district and circuit courts. They're trying to replicate this civilization of their neighbors. They created district and circuit courts. They passed laws that pretty much governed every part of life. From how many rails to make your fence, how many rails tall to make your fence, to the fact that you couldn't have a salt mine too close to somebody's house. The 2 districts that we're concerned with, and we'll talk just briefly about them, would be the Ocoee District and the Toccoa District. Toccoa District. My grandmother pronounced that Toccoa, so I think I know why. In the Ocoee District, in 1824, there were 2,500 people. 10 of those were blacks. They had 4 white men married to Cherokee women and 2 Cherokee men married to white women. There was a mission school. The Unicoi Turnpike Road, 1,191 horses. I'm sorry, 1,700 black cattle, 5,000 swine, 765 sheep. There were goats, sawmill, grist mill, plows, looms, wagons, etc. So here we have a huge difference in the culture between 120 years before to now. And this was replicated throughout the nation. The other district was the Toccoa district. It looks funny there, I don't know why they spelled it that way. But there were 1,300 people, 24 blacks, 8 white men married to Cherokee women, 1 Cherokee man married to a white woman, and spinning wheels, looms, swine, black cattle, horses, a blacksmith shop, and a grist mill. The Cherokee made sure by law that if a white man came into the Cherokee territory, he would be probably a blacksmith, he would be employed by a Cherokee, and he had to have a permit. And if he committed a crime, he was gone. They wouldn't allow him to stay. They also had laws about intermarriage between Indians and whites, intermarriage between blacks and whites, and black slaves, where in 1700, if a slave escaped and went into the Cherokee Nation, he was probably welcomed because he didn't feel this same pressures that he would have felt in the white civilization. But by this time, Cherokees owned slaves. They were beginning to duplicate the laws that were going on in the white part of the nation. On November 12, 1825, the Cherokee decided to set up a national capital at Newtown at the junction of the Conasauga and the Coosawattee River. This is a couple of miles northeast of Calhoun, Georgia. It would be 100 acres, 100 lots, and it would be known as Chota, or Echota. It was named after an old town, an old sacred town that was no longer part of the Cherokee Nation. Eventually it would be called New Echota. Today it's a state historic site, and the only original building there is this building. This is the home of the Reverend Samuel Worcester. We mentioned him earlier. He was a Congregationalist missionary. He came to translate primarily. He was going to work on translating, and in fact I think he accomplished translating several books of the New Testament. The book of Matthew was the first that he did, and it was given to a rather conservative Indian, Cherokee, and he read the book and he said, well, it was a pretty good book. He just wondered why, since the white man had had it so long, he wasn't any better than he was. Samuel Worcester was from Connecticut. He had a bit of a background in printing, and he became deeply involved in the printing of the newspaper because the Cherokee Council had decided that they should have a newspaper. It was called Cherokee Phoenix. I've got a copy right up here if anybody would like to have a look at it afterward. It was printed in Cherokee and English. Not all of it was translated, only the very important parts that pertained to information that the Cherokees really needed. And that fellow that we talked about in the beginning, Elias Boudinot, was the editor. Isaac Harris was the first printer. Samuel Worcester helped them to get a printing press. It came from New England. He worked with people up there to get the Cherokee type correct and had it shipped in. The only thing they didn't get was paper. They had to wait a little bit till the paper came in. This particular press is a Washington press. They will remember us getting to help get this thing back into working condition with our good buddy Vernon Timms. That was a great time. We had a sesquicentennial on February 21st, 1978, and we had representatives from the Western Cherokee and the Eastern Cherokee who came in, and Mr. Ben Fortson, some of y'all remember him. He was Secretary of State and one of those old-time orators, and he gave a speech that day that was magnificent. As I said, it was a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. The Cherokees were rising from the ashes. If you only spoke Cherokee, you got it free. And then there was this graduated subscription rate to the point that if you only spoke English, you paid a lot more than everybody else. Cherokees had a national Supreme Court by this time, a 3-judge Supreme Court, so they prescribed that there would be a Supreme Court building built. And they said that there would be a judge's bench a certain height from the floor and a certain distance, a certain length. They didn't tell us exactly how those steps were supposed to be, but there were cases were appealed up from the lower courts. You know, we really don't know just to the extent that all of this actually worked. We think it did, but we don't have a lot of records. I know Jason's working on trying to find those, and I wish him good luck with that, because when the Georgia Guard came into New Echota and took it over, they took the printing press, they dumped the Cherokee type in Elias Boudinot's well next door, and carried the printing press off. They may have done that with any other records that they came into contact with, although the government was by that time meeting outside of Georgia. They built a council house. This time they had a 2-house legislature, the National Council and a standing committee. The standing committee was to deal directly with the United States government and ensure that no Cherokee land was lost. It wasn't going to work. And that's the inside of the council house. Again, the Cherokee law that created this gave the dimensions and a few specifics, but you just have to work on typical buildings from that time. Finally, there's a Van Tavern. This was James Van's tavern. This is not where he was killed. This tavern was located where the federal road crossed the Chattahoochee River. And when Lake Lanier was built, that site was lost, but the building was saved and brought to New Echota and re-erected. Benjamin Gold, remember him? Elias Boudinot's father-in-law visited New Echota about 1828. And he said, "This neighborhood is a truly interesting and pleasant place. The ground is as level and smooth as a house floor. The center of the nation, a new place laid out in city form. 6 new frame houses in sight, besides the council house, courthouse, printing office, and 4 stores, all inside of Mr. Boudinot's house." And Elias Boudinot's house was built very much like, as far as we know, like Samuel Worcester's house, kind of a New England style. In 1827, the Cherokees wrote a constitution. It was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. In fact, this issue that we have here has that, the parts of the Constitution in it. The preamble sounds very much like the U.S. Constitution. Even with all of these efforts to become civilized, and after having been encouraged to do so by the U.S. government some 40 years earlier, the reality was that now they were perceived as a threat. Now they had a constitution. Now they had laws. They had a legislature. They had a courts, and they had a Supreme Court. Suddenly, they were looking like a sovereign nation right here in the middle of the United States. Would they be making, would they be seeking out other countries to do business with? At least that was the excuse. That was not what they meant. They wanted to become, some of them at least thought they would be able to become a state. Georgia feared it was losing its sovereignty over the Cherokee, and if you remember, most of the Cherokee territory was located in what is now Georgia. They wanted the Cherokee land, and they were determined to take it regardless of the legality of its actions. Gold had been discovered in the late 1820s, and Georgians were trying to go in illegally into the Cherokee Nation, although there was efforts to try to keep them out. The U.S. government still wanted them to move to the west. Andrew Jackson had first come up with this idea in 1817 as an Indian commissioner. He wanted them out. He had no intention of letting them stay. And now he's president of the United States. Now that he's president, Georgia sees that possibly it's going to be able to have its way with the Cherokee. On June 1st, 1830, they annexed the entire Cherokee Nation, or at least a part of it in Georgia. On June 30th, these events took place pretty quickly. On June 30th of that same year, the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and Andrew Jackson signed it. December 21st, 1830, the 6th Georgia Land Lottery was held. It was different, or was approved. It was authorized. It wasn't held yet. Even though this land didn't belong to them, to the state of Georgia, it was going to have a lottery and auction it off, or give it away. Cherokee had never ceded this land. Okay, do something. On March 1st, 1831, Georgia enacted a law requiring all white males who resided in the Cherokee Nation to swear an oath of allegiance. This was aimed at the missionaries. The missionaries were a thorn in their side because they were able to get they had contacts in Washington, they had contacts in other parts of the country. They were able to write and get information outside the Cherokee territory as to what was going on. They supported the Cherokee efforts. Georgia wanted to get rid of them. On March 12, 1831, without warrants, the Georgia Guard arrested a number of white men working in the Cherokee Nation. Most of these were missionaries. They were released from custody because many of them were licensed and acting as agents of the United States. Samuel Worcester, for example, was postmaster of New Echota. Oops. July 7, 1831, under orders from Governor George Gilmer, the Georgia Guard arrested Samuel Worcester and 11 others, taking them to Camp Gilmer. And they marched them on foot, chained them to wagons, and made them walk that distance. A couple of the Methodist missionaries learned that one of theirs had been arrested, so they took off to intercept it, and Colonel Nelson of the Georgia Guard beat the tar out of one of them and arrested him. On September 5, 1831, the trial began in Gwinnett County of these missionaries, including Samuel Worcester and Eleazar Butler. They were all convicted. Most of them decided or said they would leave the state rather than go to jail. So they left the state rather than take the oath. But Butler and Samuel Worcester said, no, we don't believe in this. We're going to stand stiff against it. The case was taken to the Supreme Court of the United States while Worcester and Butler were in prison. And they did quite well in prison. They ministered while they were there. On March 3, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia's attempt to seize the Cherokee Nation was illegal, dismissing the charges against Worcester. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, refused to enforce the court's decision. Well, let's back up a little bit. Worcester and Butler stayed in prison for a while, but some believe at least that because of the nullification issue that was going on, Georgia decided to release them because they didn't want to get Jackson on their bad side by being accused of being nullifiers. At any rate, Gilmer commuted their sentences. October 22, 1832, that land lottery was held. And after that, Georgians felt free to come in and start taking their land. John Ross, the chief of the Cherokees at that time, this is a painting, this is an actual photograph of him on the right. He led most of the Cherokees in continuing to try to resist removal and try to retain their land, going to Washington and lobbying and trying to work on it. But on the other hand, Elias Boudinot, Major Ridge, Stan Waddy, some of you may have heard of him if you're into Civil War. He was Elias Boudinot's brother. Major Ridge was Elias Boudinot's uncle. It was a family affair. And John Ridge was Major Ridge's son. Remember, I mentioned him earlier as being married to Sarah Bird Northrop. This group had become disenchanted. They simply felt like that it all was lost, that they were not going to be able to retain the land. Everything was working against them. So they decided to negotiate with this man, the Reverend John Schermerhorn, not the most scrupulous guy. And he ended up negotiating a treaty with these 4 guys as the leader. There were about 20 people actually signed it, but none of them were the elected representatives of the Cherokee Nation. Remember, Jackson didn't really care about that. He didn't recognize them as a sovereign nation. As long as he had a treaty signed by somebody, he was happy. John Schermerhorn negotiated this treaty. There was one clause in it that said that if Cherokee chose to remain in the territory once it was taken over by Georgia, they would be given 160 acres and they could stay. Jackson took that out as soon as he saw it. On December 29, 1835, the Treaty of New Echota was signed at night in Elias Boudinot's house. Supposedly one of these guys said, I know I'm signing my death warrant. Jackson, in his address to Congress, it was a lengthy address, but he said, what good man would prefer a country covered with forest and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people. And sounds like a politician, doesn't he? 12 million happy people and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. This is probably one of the first, if you remember studying in school about manifest destiny, I think this is probably one of the first utterings of manifest destiny. He turned this removal over to Winfield Scott. This is him in his dotage. He was younger than this. I don't remember. I'm remembering my Civil War history, but he was chief of the Army when the Civil War started, and they got rid of him pretty quickly because he was not terribly energetic. But at any rate, we all know this, everybody knows this story. The Cherokees were rounded up. They were placed in stockades awaiting removal. The removal took place during the winter. They came to the Mississippi River, it was frozen. They were stalled there, disease broke out, and thousands or hundreds of them, at least thousands maybe, died before the trip was over with. John Ross's wife died. There was a postscript to all this. On June 22nd, 1839, Elias Boudinot was staying with Samuel Worcester while his house was being built. Someone came to the door and told him they needed some help. He went out with them and he was attacked and murdered. So was his uncle Major Ridge and his cousin John Ridge, all at the same time pretty much, because they had signed away this treaty and signed away Cherokee land. They were assassinated. Stan Dwight got away. He went on, as I said, he became a general during the Civil War, and supposedly was one of the last people to surrender at the end of the war. They didn't bother any of the other treaty signers, but there was a lot of discord afterward between the two groups, and eventually the treaty party people were kind of driven out, and they moved to another place down in Texas to live out the rest of their lives. But these 3 guys are all buried in the Congregationalist, the Worcester Cemetery there in Oklahoma. So the Cherokees had tried, they'd worked hard, they tried to retain their land, but it just wasn't to be. They were outnumbered, they were overwhelmed, and they had no choice, ultimately, but to leave. Do y'all have any questions? Comments? Thank you very much. I've enjoyed. Yeah, wait a minute. Somebody's got a question. Mr. Kirkendall.
Why don't you tell them about what Andrew Jackson did in the War of 1812, who his allies were?
Oh, well, yeah. well, War of 1812, yeah, against the Creeks. His allies were the Cherokees, by the way, yeah. Supposedly, Major Ridge or Junaluska, maybe it was Junaluska, that supposedly saved Andrew Jackson's life, and he later said that if he had known then what he knew later, that maybe he would have acted differently. Yeah, they fought Major Ridge. That's how Major Ridge got his title of Major. He served in Andrew Jackson's army. Yes, ma'am.
Is there really a Cherokee Nation still in North Carolina and so on, and if so, how big is it?
In North Carolina, there's the North Carolina Cherokees, the eastern band of Cherokees, and there's the western band out in Oklahoma. Both of them have a chief, and they both have organizations. I don't know the size of the reservation right offhand in North Carolina. Those people stayed. Will Thomas, who was the only white man ever to be chief of the Cherokees, and other people bought land up there and allowed Cherokees to live on it. And it's a lot more complicated than that, I guess, but and eventually it was turned over to the federal government and became a reservation. There's a legend, the story of Solly, who gave up his life after he murdered or killed. He and his sons killed an American soldier, a U.S. soldier, and he nobly gave up his life. Actually, the Cherokees went out and got him and brought him in and executed him because he had gotten them in danger. He had endangered them and bringing the army back into where they were, and they weren't too happy about that, so they took care of it. Any other questions? Yes?
Was there any effort made to collect people who did not, the Cherokees who did not go out west? Was there an attempt to round them up?
No. Wait, well, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, you know, there's a legend that a lot of Cherokees hid out in the woods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there were various ways that they managed to stay. Married to white men, possibly. If they were married to a white man, you could stay, something like that. Some of them did hide out, probably, maybe particularly up in the mountains where, particularly the Smokies, once they got out of there, the Army, U.S. Army wasn't particularly glad to go back in there. So there were probably some who hid out as well. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. That was a great education on what I think we have all heard about the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears, but now I think we can, when we hear about it, we'll know more about what the real story was and what civilized people they were. So it does make it a little bit even sadder than what we thought. But I appreciate it very much. It was very interesting. Does anybody have anything else that any questions or anything that they need?